September 11th, 2001. Four planes hijacked by the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda were headed to crash into three major U.S. monuments, the biggest being the Twin Towers in New York, where 2,753 people in Lower Manhattan died. Al-Qaeda hated how the U.S. had such a powerful influence on the world. To explain the hate that caused 9/11, we will start by going a full century back to explain the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. From 1914 to 1918, World War I was occurring, and it sparked the fight between Great Britain, France, Russia, and the US on one side, fighting against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The war was a stalemate. During World War I, Great Britain promised the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire their own country once the war was over if they revolted against the rest of the empire and helped the British win. However, Great Britain also promised that same land to a group of Jewish people from Europe who were smart scientists and very useful military researchers. These people were the Jewish Zionists. Once the Allies won the war, Great Britain controlled parts of the Ottoman Empire. This made both the Arabs and the Jewish Zionists very happy because they were both led to believe that they would each get their own state. The Jewish Zionists went to Palestine to claim the land that they were promised, but this caused conflict between the Jewish Zionists and the Arabs. Due to the constant fighting between the two groups, in 1918, Great Britain no longer allowed the Jewish people to move to Palestine. Then, in 1939, World War II started. During the Second World War, 12 million people were killed, 6 million of which were Jewish people. This became known as the Holocaust. When the war ended in 1945, sympathy from Great Britain, the United States, and the United Nations allowed the Jews to move back to Palestine between 1945 and 1948. And in 1948, the State of Israel was created. The surrounding countries were not in favor of the idea of a new state being created for the Jewish. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq tried to destroy Israel together. But due to its mass amount of stronger weapons and allies, Israel prevailed. Then, in 1967, the same Arab countries, after years of military preparation and spending, attempted to destroy Israel again. But they were defeated in a matter of only 6 days. The 6 Days War was so swift because Israel had weapons from World War II, whereas the rest had the much inferior weapons of World War I. This caused the extremists of these Islamic countries to stop relying on their governments to deal with Israel, so they took it into their own hands through terrorism. Later on, the 1970s became known as the Golden Age of Terrorism. Islamic extremists committed many acts of terrorism all around the world, including hijacking many planes. This came to an end in 1979 when the extremists then got involved in the Soviet-Afghan War. During the Soviet-Afghan War, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to impose communism around their country. The Soviet Union imposed atheism in all of their territories because they believed in serving the government and not God. This ideology offended many people all around the world. To fight against this ideology, Muslims from all parts of the world, including the Islamic extremists of the 1970s, came together to defend the Afghan people against the USSR. This group of Muslims became known as the Mujahideen. One of the many people involved in the Mujahideen was Osama bin Laden. In efforts to try and take down the Soviet Union, the US showed its support of the Afghans and the Mujahideen by giving weapons, materials, and information to them. Everything that the US gave the Mujahideen was equivalent to billions of dollars. Eventually, in 1988, the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan and lost the war. Then, in 1989, 1 year later, the USSR fell. The Afghan people were led to believe that they had destroyed a worldwide superpower and also held the belief that Allah, their God, had given them the power to do so. This gave the Afghans enough confidence to think that they could take down anything and anyone. After the war had ended, the Mujahideen established the Taliban. The Taliban became the government of Afghanistan. The Mujahideen also established Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, to recruit people from all around the world to fight for Islam. Meanwhile, in 1990, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq at the time, needed money to pay off his debts after an expensive war with Iran. So he invaded Kuwait. Kuwait was a very small country on the border of Iraq that had no military, but it had a lot of money. The invasion of Kuwait was quick. Then, Iraq also threatened to invade Saudi Arabia. His reasoning behind his plans to invade both Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were that if he won, he would then be in control of 25% of the world's total oil production. To defend itself from Iraq, Saudi Arabia asked the US for help. So the US put troops in Saudi Arabia. This offended bin Laden and al-Qaeda greatly because the Saudi Arabians asked for US help instead of the Mujahideen, even though they had just defeated the USSR. Also, on a bigger note, this put non-Muslims in holy Muslim cities, Mecca and Medina, which angered Islamic extremists and al-Qaeda even more. The war became known as the Persian Gulf War, which lasted from 1990 until the US won in 1991. Due to this anger with the US, the World Trade Center had already been threatened by al-Qaeda in 1993 during the World Trade Center bombing of 1993. Orchestrated by al-Qaeda operative Ramzi Youssef, the bombing took place in the parking garage of the North Tower. A van was loaded with dynamite, parked in the garage, then was detonated with the intent of collapsing the tower. Ramzi Youssef believed this would lead to the South Tower also collapsing due to his understanding of the domino effect. But neither tower collapsed due to insufficient quantity of explosives, and the attack ended up killing only 7 people. Fast forward 1 year, in 1994 the Somalia intervention took place. This left a disastrous famine in Somalia. With the intentions of helping the Somali people, the US tried dropping food to them. Easy fix, right? No. Warlords took the food, leaving the people with nothing, which only led to more famine and an even greater separation of power. The US military got involved and tried to stop the warlords by putting troops in Somalia to distribute and escort food and resources to civilians. And just putting troops on the ground seemed to be working, until al-Qaeda got involved. With a barrage of attacks, al-Qaeda fought the American troops, the biggest of the attacks being a bombing named Black Hawk Down. The Black Hawk Down was an attack al-Qaeda performed that downed 2 American Black Hawk helicopters full of US troops and resources that killed 18 US military soldiers and injured 73. After this attack on US troops, the military pulled out of Somalia, causing al-Qaeda to gain confidence and a new nickname for American power: Paper Tigers. That represented that they thought that although America was portrayed as a military superpower, they will fold with the slightest breeze. From that point forward, attacks on American symbols escalated with attacks on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 4 years later, in 1998. Since embassies are technically US territory, these were some of the first direct attacks on American soil. These bombings led to the deaths of 12 US citizens and over 200 Kenyan and Tanzanian civilians. As the turn of the century came and went in 2000, attacks did not cease. The USS Cole bombing occurred in 2000. A US ship off the coast of Yemen was preparing to embark when al-Qaeda bombed it using a small boat that rammed into the side of the ship and exploded. This killed 17 US soldiers and left many other wounded and injured. Moving into the events of 9/11/2001. This date is very significant and is not coincidental planning by al-Qaeda. September 11th is also the anniversary of the Camp David Accords of 1978 that made the first real steps towards peace between Israel and Palestine. These accords fueled more extremism during that time. This all leads to the horrible events on 9/11/2001. The World Trade Center was attacked along with the Pentagon with planes that were hijacked by al-Qaeda. One plane hitting the North Tower of the World Trade Center, another hitting the South Tower, and a third hitting the Pentagon. There was a fourth that crash-landed in a field in Pennsylvania. It is believed that that plane was meant for the White House. The targets represented 3 types of US power and influence all around the world. The White House representing political power, the Pentagon representing military power, and the World Trade Center representing the financial power. On the whole, 2,977 people died that day between passengers and other people in Manhattan, the Towers, and the Pentagon. But this is sadly not where the story of aggression and hate ends. After the events of 9/11, the US began the War on Terror in 2001. After 9/11, the US declared a war on the Afghan government, also known as the Taliban, because the Taliban allowed al-Qaeda to plan an attack on the US. During this time, the US started the search for bin Laden. We also tried to rebuild Afghanistan in order to create a democracy. The US eventually found bin Laden in Pakistan and killed him in 2011. Since then, al-Qaeda has been weakened. Unfortunately, the war on terror is still happening today, and the US has not stopped fighting the Taliban. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq because America feared that President Saddam Hussein had many weapons of mass destruction. The US destroyed the Iraqi army, took out the government, and captured Saddam Hussein with quite ease. But the alleged weapons the Iraqi government possessed were never actually found. Now, to explain why this invasion of Iraq set off a chain of reaction, we go back to World War I, when Iraq was made a state by Great Britain. The British used the divide and conquer tactic to gain more allies and power. Divide and conquer was used by Great Britain so that they could side with many groups that despised each other by essentially fueling conflict between groups to ensure the absence of unity and rebellion. Iraq had three main divisions. 60% of Iraqis were Arab Shia Muslims, 30% were Arab Sunni Muslims, and the remaining 10% were Kurd Shia Muslims. During Saddam Hussein's presidency, he oppressed the Shia and Kurdish Muslims in Iraq. But even in the years following his removal from being president, the three groups have not gotten along. All three groups are still fighting and trying to oppress each other. This is what has made making a democracy so difficult in Iraq. In 2003, there were US troops stationed in Iraq until America pulled out in 2012. Overall, Sunni Muslims make up the majority of Muslims all around the world, and they supported Saddam Hussein since they were so afraid of Shia Muslims who hold the majority of the population in Iraq. Then, to fuel the conflict even more, in 2010 to 2011, people in the Middle East were trying to fight against dictators to promote democracy and started what we call the Arab Spring. Tunisia and Egypt both had relatively peaceful revolutions and successfully created new democracies. Whereas in Syria and Libya, it led to civil war. During the civil war in Syria, al-Qaeda went into Iraq to attack American troops, and al-Qaeda in Iraq joined with extremists to create the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, also known as ISIS. Bashar al-Assad, who was the president of Syria at the time, released groups of terrorists known as jihadists to join ISIS and other rebel groups because he wanted to support ISIS to distract the UN and the rest of the world from the atrocious acts he was performing on the rebels of his country. And his strategy generally worked. Countries in the West, including the US, focused more on ISIS and not on Assad. Now, US and Kurdish forces are fighting ISIS, but the strange thing about ISIS is that the more territory they lose in Iraq and Syria, the more ISIS attacks the West. Some of these attacks on the West are acts of domestic terrorism. People believed that there would be constant attacks on innocent civilians after 9/11. From 2013 to today, ISIS has been guilty of many shootings, bombings, car and van attacks, as well as many other forms of domestic violence. These attacks have been scattered all around the world, including Europe, the US, and other Western countries. But they've mainly been in Iraq. Although most of the ISIS attacks occur in Iraq, the US has still been greatly affected by ISIS. ISIS has inspired many attacks on the US. An example of an attack was inspired by ISIS happened on June 12, 2016, when a shooter by the name of Omar Mateen killed 49 people at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Omar Mateen was a US citizen of Afghan descent that had been described by ISIS as one of the soldiers of the Caliphate in America. Because of the attacks on 9/11, people have started to target Muslims and Sikhs and associate them with people involved in terrorism. Although Sikhs are not even Muslim, because of their appearance, people have mistaken them for Muslims. The anti-Islamic sentiment is the overall hatred or fear of Muslims, their culture, and/or political views. People all over the Western world have tried to express that fear through different laws, protests, and rallies. One example was on June 10, 2017 in New York City when a group of protesters called the March Against Sharia tried to express their strong feelings against Islam. This nationwide march has happened in over 19 states. Many people fear that the Middle East and parts of Africa are threats to our country because of the effects of extremists and terrorists in that area of the world. Earlier this year, President Donald Trump banned immigrants from 6 predominantly Muslim countries to enter the US. These countries are Iran, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. The origins of 9/11 and our modern-day issues with Islamic extremism and the war on terror have roots going all the way back to World War I. The war on terror is still being fought today against ISIS. Although the territory of these terrorists is shrinking rapidly, ISIS may survive as what it started as, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and in that form could inspire terrorism for years to come.